Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's presentation on aircraft wheel and brake maintenance by Cleveland Wheels and Brakes. My name is Jeff Simon. I'm president of SocialFlight. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. SocialFlight is the free web and mobile app dedicated to supporting general aviation. Visit SocialFlight.com or download the free SocialFlight mobile app for Apple and Android devices, and you'll have access to over 10,000 aviation events, destinations, and airport restaurants. You'll even have a weekly email with a list of aviation events that are happening in your local area. Our mission is to give pilots like you more reasons to get out there and fly. Now, in addition to events that you can fly to, we also have online events such as this webinar week, which is why we are all here this evening. As an A&P mechanic and an IA, I've used Cleveland products since the first days that I ever worked on an aircraft, and I have always been impressed with the quality, the reliability, and most importantly, the serviceability of Cleveland products. And the same is true of their people. I first met Vern Rogers many years ago when I was filming the Educated Owner video series about aircraft maintenance. He's a friend of mine, an industry expert, and truly my first call anytime that I hit an issue related to wheels and brake systems. Now, he's been with Cleveland for, I believe, 35 years, which is impressive for a guy who doesn't seem a day over 40 himself. So I am looking forward to learning more from him tonight. And let's get started. Now, just before we begin, a couple of notes. First of all, a recording of tonight's presentation will be available on SocialFlight.com and the SocialFlight YouTube channel within about 24 hours. Just do a search for SocialFlight for anything that you may have missed in tonight's presentation. You can also post questions in the Q&A section during the presentation. We'll do our best to try to get some of those questions into the presentation. However, rest assured that any questions that don't get addressed here will be sent directly to Vern so that he can handle that tomorrow or whenever he's able to do that and get back to you personally with any question if you didn't get it answered directly by us here. And of course, with AirVenture coming right around the corner, I'm sure that, that there's a lot going on, but we'll certainly do our absolute best. So with that, I would like to introduce Vern Rogers, Technical Support Manager with Cleveland Wheel and Brakes. Welcome, Vern.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on tonight's webinar. Jeff, thank you for the warm reception. I mean, that's hard to follow up. As you stated, we have known each other for a number of years, and you're a very great person, and I think you do a terrific job with SocialFlight, and no matter where you are in the world, I mean, SocialFlight's there to help you and guide you to all the events that you would like to attend, or even events in your area that you didn't think were even in your area. Jeff can help you with all those needs for everything that you do. So again, we can go ahead and jump right into the maintenance presentation. And I'll first begin with a little brief history on our division, give you some of our in-house testing capabilities, discuss our product line, both internal multiple rotor brakes versus external calipers, utility hydraulics, conversion kits. The maintenance presentation will consist on both on and off aircraft maintenance checks. This evening we're going to be discussing external wheels and brakes, and we're going to talk about lubricants, our website, and hotline contacts as well. We're physically located in Avon, Ohio, and if any of you on the webinar this evening are in the Cleveland area or will be traveling to the Cleveland area and would like to see our facility, by all means reach out to me and we'll be more than happy to take you on a tour and show you what we do and how we do things in Avon, Ohio, which is about 15 miles west of Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, so jumping right into our utility hydraulics. This first up is our master cylinders, and you can see there on the bottom right, there's two styles of master cylinders that we do manufacture, one being the reservoir master cylinder, which is the top one, and then the bottom is the non-reservoir style master cylinder. Doesn't mean that it doesn't need a reservoir, but just the reservoir is either located adjacent to the master cylinder or mounted on your firewall. And with the master cylinders, you can buy all the individual components that you see there. If they're PMA, you can buy the complete assembly or the seal repair kit to repair your master cylinders, and you can do that through any of our local distributors. The parking brake valve is very similar to the master cylinders. Same thing applies if we own the PMA, then you can get the complete assembly or any of those parts that you see there on your screen through any of the distributors, including the seal repair kit, which we recommend changing the seals in the master cylinders and parking brake valves every 10 years. A lot of people will let it go longer than that, but then you begin having issues and get a little bit more rubbing going on from the metal to metal or aluminum to aluminum. And to avoid that, changing the O-rings is a very good idea. Just to give you just a little bit of an idea of who we are and what our platforms are, is 90% of the reciprocating engine aircraft and 70% of the general aviation aircraft. Cleveland Wheels and Brake has products on those various models. General aviation is our backbone, is how we got started. We've also moved into the business aircraft sector as well, being turboprops or light jets. In addition to that, we do a lot of work with civil helicopters. And on the military side, we have the military helicopters, trainers, and UAVs. For any of you out there that have our technical information, whether it's the product catalog, the maintenance manual, or the technician service guide, doesn't matter what you have on your shelf today, everything is available on our website. You can download the product catalog, maintenance manual, or the technician service guide at no charge to you. Only thing that we print today is the technician service guide. And for any of you that will be at Oshkosh next week, we will be there in Hangar C, and the booth is 3087 and 3088. Please stop by, see us, and I'll be happy to hand you a technician service guide and chat with you a little bit. And for those of you that do most of your checking or checking our online services, this is how you can get to our online services by going to www.clevelandwheelsandbrakes.com, and there's all kinds of new information on there in addition to our product catalog, maintenance manual, and technician service guide. If you have questions, we do have a live chat from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There's someone typically on there to answer any questions that you may have. Only reason that during the day that there's no one there is people are attending meetings. But there's all sorts of good information, such as service bulletins, product reference manuals. Just to learn more about our products in general, you can go right to our website. And as I was mentioning before, with the website, you can click on the product catalog. You can download the PDF, or you can go into the live chat sector or expert insight, upcoming events, such as Oshkosh next week. There will be a team of us there, and we will be stationed at Hangar C, but we also will be at Kid Venture. We're going to have a live demo at Kid Venture every day. So if you're there and want to stop by Kid Venture and learn how to do your own disc and linings, you can certainly come there, and we can allow you to do your own disc and linings and show exactly how to use our products, tools, and a whole bit. On our campus, we also have a certified repair station I know there are many people out there that love going flying but don't necessarily want to work on their own equipment, which is perfectly fine with us. In our certified repair station, we only work on our products, whether it's the wheels, the brakes, master cylinders, parking brake valves, actuators. As long as it's our product, we will take it back, get you a quote, show exactly what we need to do and how much it's going to cost you in the quote before we do any type of work, and make sure that you approve of it. And once you receive the equipment back, it's ready to go onto the aircraft and back into the service. Here, I like to just take a moment, because this is a external wheel and brake, typically a wheel that you would see on a King Air. And kind of what I'm showing here is it doesn't matter whether the brakes are before or after the gear. It depends on what the OEM recommends, but it makes no difference to the braking system itself, because it won't affect the form, fit, and function of our assemblies. Now you notice the two arrows there at the bottom, they're pointing at the 5 and 7 o'clock position. If you have a brake assembly that is mounted at that point in between those two arrows, that's definitely not something that we recommend, because undoubtedly, if you end up having a blown tire or a flat tire, that brake caliper is going to go right into the runway, and that's going to cause you more problems than good. I mean, because you can damage the brake, the wheel, the gear. There's undetermined of what you can possibly damage to, so you want to stay away from those areas. Also, the holes going up the gear leg, sorry about that, the holes going up the gear leg, you want to make sure that, again, that's changed every 10 years is our recommendation from our sister division, which is SocialFlight. On aircraft maintenance, general conditions, paint and corrosion, holes and connector inspection, hardware and insulator inspection, disc inspections, dimensions and flatness, lining inspections and replacement, lubricant of anchor bolts. All right, so when we get into talking about corrosion, prime, and paint, all three can be covered under this one slide. And when you're talking about corrosion, typically corrosion will begin in the piston bore areas, the colors you see highlighted in copper there. Also, in addition to that, the mounting holes going across the top of the cylinder housing can also get corrosion infected. And once you start that corrosion, there's no turning back. You cannot turn back the time. It's going to continue and only get worse. So at some point, you're going to end up having to replace that cylinder housing for the corrosion. There are things that you can do to slow the pitting and corrosion down, but nothing that you can do to permanently stop it. And our calipers are made primarily from a magnesium or aluminum housing. And when you're priming or painting those same cylinder housings that you're seeing there on the screen, you want to make sure the copper color areas are masked off, as well as the holes, the mounting holes are going across the cylinder housing itself, because they're very tight tolerances. And if you get any kind of primer paint in those areas, your parts, being your pistons, your anchor bolts, your bleeder screw, your fittings, will not fit back into place as they're designed to do, and will create more havoc than good.
Now, Vern, some of the times when we talk about corrosion and when we see it in these areas, I assume that, you know, that can happen with, especially when water's able to get in there, when people don't bleed and you know, flush out fluid when it's left. I've seen, you know, 20-year-old hydraulic fluid in systems. Mm-hmm. What can be done to try to prevent some of that damage from happening?
Well, a little good question, Jeff, for sure. One of the things you definitely want to do is maybe perhaps do a little bit more frequent maintenance is because technically the cylinders and the wheels both are on condition, but annually you should be looking at your wheels and your brakes to ensure that everything's functioning properly, that you're not beginning the stages of the corrosion, and if you are, you can catch it early and do some things to slow that down. Now you can use a little emery or crocus cloth by the 600 grit to clean up the cylinder housings if you spend only 2 to 3 minutes. If you spend more than that, then the possibilities are you're going to take off the protection, corrosion, and the hardness that we put into those cylinder housings to keep them from pretty much corroding and pitting, as well as staying hard enough to make sure that the pistons stay true and do everything that they need to do. So a little bit more regular maintenance helps.
And so those, cylinders themselves, they're painted on the outside basically, but the inside areas are themselves also, is it, I don't know, anodized or coated or something like that when they come brand new?
Correct. We do analyze them or anodize them, I'm sorry, and they are painted on the outside. We mask everything off, so we, as I explained earlier, so we don't get the paint or primer inside the piston board area, the anchor bolt area, because it makes it very difficult when it comes to installing the rest of the parts. Okay, off aircraft maintenance. First up is our aligning wall chart. It's a great tool. I have one in my office. I see as I fly around or visit different aircraft manufacturers as well as FBOs or just individuals in hangars, I do see the aligning wall charts. It's loaded with a ton of good information. It shows you the exact size of the organic or metallic pad. So if you don't know the part number, all you have to do is pull the pad off the brake, stick it up right to the wall chart, and it will let you know exactly what that pad is. And normally from there, you can kind of back into the rest of the parts if you do not know what your assembly part numbers are. In addition to that, it talks about our go, no-go gauges up in the right-hand corner at the top, and that is our minimum thickness gauge as well. And it allows you to measure your linings. The linings are 100 thousandths, no matter whether it's organic or metallic. If you wear it down past that gauge there, then you're most likely going to run into the steel plate if it's metallic, or you're going to run into the rivets if it's organic, and that's going to cost you additional money. So we're trying to prevent you having to spend additional money. It also gives you the most commonly used rivets and pins that we use in our manufacturing process. It talks a little bit about the conditioning procedure, because that is vital if you want longer life out of your disc and out of your linings. And this talks a little bit more in depth about the minimum thickness gauge. As you can see at the middle of the page to the right, it shows 100 thousandths minimum lining thickness, and that's right on the gauge, so you don't have to guess or think about it. You just slide that up to the back side of the pressure plate or to the back plate, and if you've got 100 thousandths or better still left on your pads, you're perfectly fine to go flying. If you're getting close to that, then it may be a good time to take a break from flying and do a little maintenance on the aircraft. You can also check the minimum thickness for the linings as well as the brake disc in our technician service guide or maintenance manuals. Now this is an interesting picture, and this was sent to us by a person working on the aircraft, and they couldn't quite figure out what was going on. The left side, as you can see, is very severely worn to the fact that it's metal on metal in some places. And the right side looks like the day they installed it. And it's the same aircraft, same wheel and brake, it's the correct parts, but what's going on there? One, quite possibly, the regular maintenance hasn't been kept up. So either the pistons are coming out of the housing and not retracting back, making a permanent drag onto the linings and disc, which will wear them out much sooner than expected or anticipated. Or it could be some FOD that got in there and just kind of caused everything to get all crazy and wear down much sooner than expected. But what I want to explain here is if you see something like that, don't just throw parts at it. Should be a red flag, and you want to find out what the root cause of that excessive wear on one side versus no wear on the right side. So just as a precaution and a heads up, make sure you find out the root cause.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, Vern. One of the best times to figure these types of things out for everyone is when it's after your flight. When you're pushing the aircraft back into the pad or into the hangar, and this is when, if you're hearing a noise, if you're hearing like that kind of slight squealing as you're pushing the plane back, your brakes are probably still warm or hot from landing, and you can tell if it's a little hard to do something too, and that's the best time to make a note that you've got to do something about the maintenance. And in some cases, it's the perfect time to actually throw a jack underneath one side or whatever you need to, and see how each wheel is actually spinning. Because if it is hanging up, once you get heat and you find that it's really not releasing, then it's going to wind up like the brakes on the left-hand side of the image. You're going to have some trouble. And finding that out after a flight is a great opportunity, because there's a lot less pressure to ignore it and continue. It gives you that opportunity. You're going home anyway. It's time to order parts. It's time to research. It's time to talk to your mechanic, whatever the right step is of identifying it, and plan out your next thing, rather than discovering something pre-flight and wanting kind of to sort of ignore it so you can complete the flight that you have planned for the day.
Absolutely correct. And just to piggyback on that, Jeff, if you're hanging your aircraft and you're done flying for the day, as Jeff mentioned, and you push your airplane back and you notice a more dragging than normal, then something could be going on there, and it's something you want to investigate sooner versus later, because later kind of ends up with the result on the left-hand side there.
Yeah, and that can come from many sources. We actually had that happen recently on the Bonanza, and I actually worked with Vern on the solution. You kind of go down a checklist. You start with the pins that, as you see in the inside of the picture, that those plates that have the holes on them slide on the pins, and so do the calipers through the bracket. And certainly, if that's not sliding cleanly, that can cause it. And then your next move is, what's happening inside those pistons. In our case, there was corrosion in the pistons, and they weren't wanting to retract very easily. And so once we'd removed the concept or the issue of the pins being the problem and got inside the caliper itself, that's when you dig and find the next level of problem to see what's happening. And then another quick tip on that is that if another trick you can always do if you're really dragging, if something's not releasing, is to see if you just barely crack that bleeder valve, the tiniest bit. It'll only take a drop or two to take pressure off. If all of a sudden you don't, now everything's spinning cleanly, that tells you that the pressure's not releasing. Could be in the caliper, could be in the master, but this is something, of course, the things I'm talking about need to be done with the supervision of a mechanic. But there's some great tips on how to diagnose and go about that with your system.
Absolutely. Here, there's a few things that could be going on as well. You can see, obviously, there's a piece of the lining missing. There's also a chunk that's kind of cracked there as well. And normally that's contributed to a couple of things. One is over tightening of the rivets. you don't think that's a possible thing to do, but it absolutely is. I don't know if some of you may recall, using the old punch and anvil style, where you have the punch and then you take the hammer and you try to make a good connection with the rivets, so it gives it a nice rounded touch on the other side of the rivet that seats it well. A lot of times you can overdo that. One of the other things that I see that possibly is going on here is a overheating condition. And the reason I say that is because you can see on the plate itself, it looks like there's some darkened color, and there's some weird things going on with the lining itself. And also, if you look closely at the edges of the lining that is still remaining, there is the fact that someone installed the lining but didn't bother to do the conditioning procedure. Now, I'm here as a maintenance professional, and I want to see you get the longest life out of your products. But on the flip side of that, I'm happy to sell you products all day long. But for our intents and purposes this evening, make sure that you do the conditioning procedures, because if you do not, then you can truly expect a much shorter life on your disc and linings. And you say, well, maybe I don't need to do the conditioning procedure because I'm only installing pads this time, or vice versa, I'm only installing the disc this time, my pads are fine. Doesn't matter. You still need to condition those parts together, because if you're only replacing the pads, then the pads are brand new and you've got this old glazing on your brake disc. So what you need to do from that standpoint is take, again, some 600 grit emery or crocus cloth and take that glaze off of the brake disc. It only takes you 1 or 2 minutes to do it. Go around the whole disc, both rubbing surfaces, and then you can bond those two together by doing a conditioning procedure. And vice versa, if you are only changing the disc out because your pads are fine, that's fine. You're working with a new disc surface to begin with, so that's great. But you want to take your linings, same deal, take the 600 grit emery or crocus cloth and get the top layer glaze off. That's all you need to do. Once you have that top layer glaze off, then you're ready to condition your existing pads with your new brake disc, and I assure you that will get you a much longer life out of your disc and linings.
And I'd like to add something from my personal experience that, again, may or may not be something that Vern could say directly from Cleveland, but there are obviously different companies and different products out there when it comes to the brake pads. And there's a pretty significant price difference, even though we're talking smaller numbers, right? A brake, you could go anywhere from $6 to $26 for a brake pad or something like that. But I would encourage people, especially if you're going to a show and you have an opportunity to actually see them firsthand, to look yourself at the quality difference between the Cleveland linings and some of the other linings that are out there, because there is a visual difference that is very dramatic. And I know they are all PMA certified, they are all legal, and the FAA has said, safe for the aircraft and everything else. But you really see a difference, and I have personally really seen a difference in how they perform in the field and what linings have a greater tendency to not kind of go quite the distance along there. And so since the parts themselves are a lot less than the shop rate to actually do the work, again, I'd encourage you to go check it out for yourself, look at it firsthand, and make your own decision on quality when it comes to something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had people that, have used our products for years and gone away from it and tried, another PMA, which is fine, because, they were less expensive, but sometimes you get what you pay for. And far as reliability and safety goes, you cannot beat our products. Understandably so. We are not the cheapest manufacturer, but we do stand behind our quality. And, you know, one of the things that we do for that is we perform safety seminars or webinars, such as what we're doing this evening. We have a technical support hotline dedicated just for people that have questions. Now we have a chat line online, and those resources are available to you when you need them.
And I have seen, you know, the linings fail as are in this picture. Seen it myself, seen chips and pieces come out. And one of the things to consider, aside from just general safety on something like that, is the fact that these are the sacrificial parts of the system. And if you lose a brake lining, or it gets broken in a way that you now have metal-to-metal contact in some way, you're starting to eat into very, very expensive parts, as opposed to the sacrificial parts. So you really do want to make sure that that's intact and that it's in the best, best condition possible, and that you have the product that you want there, so you don't wind up with a gouged disc or other things that end up being hundreds instead of a few dollars.
Absolutely correct. All right, here we're beginning the cleaning process. So we're installing our own linings with our own pads, with our own backplate, pressure plate, and rivets. First thing you want to do is remove the old linings from the backplate and pressure plate, and make sure that you do in fact clean the pressure plate and backplate off of all old or lining material, because if you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice by installing some of the new lining over some of the old material that may still be, or remnants of the old material on the backplate and pressure plate. So make sure that you do clean everything off. That's very important to the longevity of your parts as well. In here, we're installing the lining onto the pressure plate, and there's a couple ways to look at this. The pressure plate is kind of tricky, but very easy in another respect, because there are two sides to the pressure plate. There's a flat side with a hole going through it, and the reverse side is a flat plate with a hole going through it with a recess, which you can see there in the picture. And the rivet actually will rest, or the rivet head comes up through the bottom, and you get the nice roll on the side that you see there in the picture. And that is the proper way in which you should be installing your new pads onto your pressure plate. All right, so looks like there's one rivet firmly in place that isn't cracked on the pressure plate, and they're installing the second side, or the second rivet as they're showing it here. And what other thing that you want to make sure of is, which we will cover here in a minute, so I won't even speak to that now, but they are installing that properly as we see it.
Vern, one tip tell me if this is correct, but I was always taught that, using this tool, which is really inexpensive for people to get, especially if you're able to work with your mechanic on it and get them to sign off on your work supervised. Again, these are pretty straightforward. Flat side, as you mentioned, of the rivet goes into the lining, and then you're rolling it over here on the plate, and you tighten it down until basically it just starts to turn the plate and lining as a unit kind of away from you. You tighten it until the tool, as you twist it, starts moving those, and that's kind of the point to back off. Is that correct?
That is correct, Jeff. And in addition to that, what you want to do is, as you're tightening that or squeezing the rivet, so that you are in fact getting a nice roll, when you install the first one, you can kind of gauge how much pressure or tension that you want to put on that plate and rivet before over torquing it or over squeezing it, if you will. So to make sure that you do that, make sure that that first rivet's in and that the lining is not moving sloppily against the other hole. If it's pretty nice and firm and it lines up with the second rivet hole, then you've done yourself a good service.
Right, and then so basically you've got that second rivet held in place so you don't have to move anything at the same time as you're installing the first one.
Exactly.
For alignment purposes.
Right. All right, Cleveland manufactures two different types of linings, very easy to know. We have organic lining, which you see on the right-hand side of the picture, and we have metallic, which you see on the left-hand side. And you can very easily tell them apart. The organic hole, if you held the lining up, I'm sorry, the organic linings, if you held the lining up and you see two holes or three holes, whatever the application calls for, and you can see out beyond the lining itself, that means that it's organic because there's a hole going all the way through the lining. If it is a metallic lining, you would hold it up in the same manner in which you would do the organic lining, but you're not going to see any holes, or you can't see beyond the lining because there's no holes going all the way through. It has a metal backing plate with the friction material installed onto the front side of that plate, and when you reverse the lining, you will see there's a couple of holes that have, or not a couple of holes, but they're indents where the pin will sit, because the metallic lining uses pins opposed to rivets. The organic lining uses the rivets, the metallic uses the pins. And when you're installing the metallics, one of the things you want to definitely recognize is you install it, okay, my pins are in place, I'm putting the new linings on the pins, I tip the brake up and my linings fall off. Okay, so what do you do about that? Very easily, you take either a drop of adhesive, not a permanent bond adhesive, but something that you have in your shop that's just going to keep everything intact until you get everything together and do your conditioning procedure. Because once you do the conditioning procedure, it heats the pads up. The pads will stick to the back plate and to the pressure plate, and you don't have to worry about them coming off until you do a lining change again. And the other step to metallic lining, if you don't want to use adhesive, you can take a punch, put a little burr on the tip of the pin, and typically the linings will snap on and stay in place for a much longer period. Those pins are fairly expensive, so it's not anything that you have to change every time you change linings, because you can just insert a screwdriver in between the linings and the plate of the or the back plate or the pressure plate, and usually they will just pop off, and then you install your new pads for the metallics. The organics, obviously, just like we saw on the past couple pictures, when you're installing a pad onto a back plate pressure plate, is held in place by rivets.
And a quick note on those. I mean, most, I would imagine most people that are dialed in here probably have organics with the rivets. You know, one of the things we've seen there many times is people who drill out or punch out without a lot of care those rivets that end up damaging those back plates, and that's a lot of money damage for nothing. Those things are soft, and if you have that tool that was shown earlier, you can easily push those brass rivets out safely, centered, and making sure that you're not damaging the back plate. And if you do have an elongated hole, if you do find that in the case, it's not safe to continue to use it over and over, because your lining is not going to be securely attached. It's just like any other key structural component. if your hole's elongated and you're trying to drive a rivet into it, it's not going to be secure. And in this case, you've only got 2 of them, and it's a critical function, and they're they're not incredibly strong. They're not made to deal with filling oblong holes.
Absolutely. So you want to make sure that if you are in fact drilling them out, it gets to be a little scary, because as Jeff mentioned, if you elongate those holes or oversize those holes, they're not going to do you any good. And you need to go ahead and replace the backplate or pressure plate, whichever ones are damaged, or if you need to, replacing both. Here we're talking about riveting. As we have discussed over the last few photos, when you're riveting, you're allowed up to 3 splits in a rivet head. Anything beyond 3 splits needs to be punched out with the riveting tool that you saw back on a couple slides ago, or with a punch or something like that, just being very careful not to damage the holes themselves in the backplate or pressure plate. You don't have to have any splits, but you can have 1, you can have 2, up to 3, and they should be about 45 degrees apart from one another. But if you get it all together and you don't have any splits, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you've got a nice firm squeeze onto the backplate and pressure plate, but not over squeezing to a point that you will see cracking, because at that point you've done yourself a disservice and you're going to have to redo everything all over again. So only up to 3 splits on a rivet head.
Vern, does Parker Cleveland make the tool for putting the rivets on?
No, unfortunately we do not. We used to have the old punch and anvil at one point, but we've kind of gotten away from it. We were selling the rivet tools that you saw back a few slides ago, but we've gotten away from that as well. There are folks out there, being our competitors, that do make the riveting tool, and it's the only thing that I will, say positive about
Endorse.
their product. Endorse their product, yeah. But it works out.
Yeah,
it is a good tool.
There's a few of them out there that are those tools that you put in a vise that you can see there. Someone had sent in a question about it. There is no reason at this point in time, in my personal opinion, to use a punch, to use a drill, to use any of those things. You can get those tools that just sit in a vise. They're not expensive, and they have different adapters that go on. One of them just drives out the old rivet. It centers it. You have nothing to worry about damaging anything, and then you just switch it, and it switches it over to one that presses it down properly. And once someone shows you the right technique to just center it, make sure both those rivets are being held in place just for alignment, and then as you're tightening one down, you do it until it's snug and just starts to turn the entire assembly together. You pretty much get a perfect fit every time. You don't risk damaging anything. So it just doesn't make sense, in my opinion, to do anything else when you've got a very inexpensive tool available that pretty much makes it perfect every time.
Absolutely. I mean, you can buy those riveting tools for under $50, and it's well worth it, and you have the tool for years to come. So far as the brake assembly goes, this is the complete assembly. You've got your calipers, the pistons, backplate, pressure plate, torque plate, anchor bolts, nuts, bolts, washers, and we're going to dissect this whole thing, talk about the parts individually, and be ready for any questions that you may have. Okay, first up is going to be the torque plate. We have made changes to the torque plate. For years and years, we had a steel torque plate with CAD plating over the top. Everyone knows that CAD plating is not the healthiest thing for you. We are in a green or environmentally friendly company, and so we've gotten away from CAD plating now, and we've gone to a one-piece stainless steel investment casting. The ears used to be brazed on for the anchor bolts to slide through. That's all one piece. And we've done some very rigorous testing on this, and we know that you will get years and years of service without having to replace your torque plates. Pistons. Pistons are usually pretty hardy. You can use them time and time again. You want to make sure that you do clean them up, make sure that there is no pitting or corrosion setting in on the pistons. If you have a piston that has a friction spring on it, that means that you want to make sure that right around that friction spring area, there is no damage to the tip of that piston. If there is, in fact, damage there, most likely there will be damage to the inside of the brake cylinder housing as well. And with both of those being damaged, you really will need to replace both of them, because it's very vital that that friction spring is in there and that it sits in the proper place inside the cylinder housing so it doesn't move side to side and or possibly cock on you. So you want to be very careful of that. If you have a piston that has an insulator on the front side of the piston, make sure that that insulator is intact and that you will make it to your next annual without having any difficulties. If the insulator is partially missing or you don't think it's going to make it to the next annual, replace it. And first and foremost, anytime you're doing a brake repair, brake overhaul, you want to make sure that you're changing your O-rings. If you do everything else and neglect to change your O-rings, that is the thing that's going to cause you the most pain, because you're going to make everything look really nice. You're going to put it all back together, get everything torqued down, and I assure you that you will have a leaky O-ring if that's the case. So make sure that you do change out the O-ring as well. And this is something that should be done on an annual basis as well, depending on how you're using your aircraft and also, you know, the area in which you live, because some places are sandy, some places are hot. Some aircraft you land, you know, over the fence, you're coming in pretty hot and heavy, say 100 knots or a little bit faster. And all of that takes a set on or toll on your pistons and on your O-rings, and therefore they need to be maybe changed on a more frequent basis, or at least annually, or at least inspect them to ensure that you're not overstepping your bounds there and leaving them in for too long, because you don't want any hydraulic fluid to proceed out at all. Cylinder deformation. One of the things that's really interesting about this is how you get cylinder deformation by over torquing your bolts onto the housing, and it makes the back plate concave inward. You can very easily tell what's going on when you look at your lining and you've got wear on the outboard side or the inboard side of your lining versus the other side, which has a lot more pad still left. So that tells me that you do have some crushing. One of the things you won't notice about this is if you have a crushed cylinder housing or cylinder deformation, if you have worn linings or you have a worn brake disc, it's never going to come into play at all. But once you change out either the disc or linings or both, you're going to go from having an aircraft that you can push back into the hangar without having any problems to an aircraft that when you change the disc and linings or one or the other, that most likely the wheel will not even turn, and that could be some of the reason why is the cylinder deformation or the crushing around the cylinder holes. So if you do encounter the cylinder deformation, the only thing that you can do is actually replace the cylinder housing itself.
And I'll just say, I see this in the field all the time. I mean, the last thing you should be doing when it comes to any of these things is just going by feel on these assembly bolts. right. I keep the Cleveland guide with me, and I have to refer to it each time. But you're talking 80, 90, 70 inch pounds as to what's used for these. It's surprisingly light amount of torque, and you need to do it right. You need to use a torque wrench. You need to have new block washers every time that you disassemble and reassemble this, because I've seen people snapping the bolts, putting the things together, which just boggles the mind and ends up damaging all these parts. They really don't take a lot of torque.
Right. And this is one of the examples that we've heard. A gentleman called the tech line one day, and just as the same scenario I just explained, he rolled the aircraft into the hangar, decided they wanted to change the disc and linings. No problem, shouldn't have been. He changed the disc and linings and found that the aircraft would not roll at all. So he calls and say, hey, have you guys ever seen this? What do we need to do? What did we do wrong? You didn't do anything wrong, but during the whole course in life of the housings, things happen. So you can see on the top right-hand corner, around the cylinder where it mates to the backing plate, there's some crushing there. Not a great deal, but there is some crushing there. So that is a concern, obviously. The pressure plate, if you have a pressure plate, make sure that you put it on a registered flat surface and take your index finger, go around each corner. If it lifts up, that means it's no longer flat. So you have an option. One is either to flatten it, or two is to replace it with a new flat torque or pressure plate. And the third thing is what we've been seeing is back plates. Over 20 years, 30 years, things will give. And in this particular case, the back plate actually warped and caused the issue. So in the top left-hand corner and in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a little daylight between the cylinder housing and the back plate. And that's exactly what happened. And that was the cause of their issue with the wheel not being able to rotate. So they they flattened the pressure plate. They ended up changing the back plate, and the cylinder housing was okay. They just cleaned it up a little bit more, torqued everything down, and they were able to roll the aircraft out of the hangar as it rolled into the hangar. So they were very pleased with that. One of the questions I like to typically ask the audience, looking at this visual here, is this something on a cylinder housing that is serviceable, or would you just scrap it out and have and put it on your desk as a conversation piece? Personally, I would put it on my desk and have a conversation piece about it, because you can tell there's all kinds of issues. In addition to corrosion, you've got crushing around the boat holes. You even have your anchor bolts that are corroded and pitting inside the piston bore area. That's only the mild stuff. Now, when you look at the two opposite corners of the cylinder housing where the boat holes go through, you can actually see material missing. And the question came into us whether we should give them a written permission to put this back into service, and there's no way in the world that Cleveland's going to support that. We're going to tell you to replace the housing, because that's absolutely the worst cylinder housing that you want to see, and you don't want to see that out in the field. You want everyone to be safe. So the recommendation from us to the technician that called in was to replace it. Lining wear characteristics. This one I just wanted to show a couple of things here. One being the anchor bolts. Question has always been, do you lubricate the anchor bolts or should they be dry? Well, when we send them out from the factory, they are completely dry. Understanding over the life course of the life of the cylinder, you're going to need some help with things to slide a little bit more freely. So here's the recommendation on that. No oil, no grease, graphite or dry slide on the anchor pins. That's all, nothing else. Or something that goes on dry and stays dry. Or if it goes on wet and it dries, do not install that into the cylinder housing until it's completely dry. That's why we only recommend dry slide and graphite. We know exactly what that's going to do. That's the only thing that you need on the anchor bolts. If you don't have that, clean the anchor bolts up and put them back into service without putting anything on them whatsoever. All right, getting towards the end of the brake assembly housing. So once you gotten to the point where everything is reassembled, you're now torquing everything down. You don't want the Popeye effect. We give you the tools such as the maintenance manuals, technician service guide that have all the torque values in there. Don't make up your own, because as we saw earlier, you don't want to over torque those cylinder housings, because that's going to cause you to have crushing around those bolt holes on the housing itself, and that's only going to cost you some additional money. So follow our recommended torque guide and torque it properly. All right, so we're jumping right from the brakes into the wheels. Maintenance checks at the tire change. Visually inspect wheels for cracks and tool marks. Measure disc for wear minimum limit thickness. Inspect disc for cup and coning. Inspect bearing, cup and cone. Inspect wheel hardware. Check disc and wheels for corrosion and repair and paint as necessary. First and foremost, anytime you're working on an aircraft, you're working around the wheels, no matter what, at least one call annually we receive by someone beginning to work on wheels, took the axle nut off the aircraft, slid the wheel off, and began loosening the bolts. In many cases on our wheels, we have 3 bolts holding the wheels together. Some cases 6. But in most cases 3. Once you begin loosening those bolts and you haven't deflated the tire, it becomes a serious issue for not only you, but the people around you. Again, safety is our biggest thing. We practice it in our shops, we practice it in our office, and we want to keep all of you that are working on your aircraft parts using our equipment to be safe as well. So make sure you deflate your tire before doing any kind of maintenance checks. All right, so on the wheel assemblies, you have wheel halves. You have the inboard, you have the outboard, you have the inboard, you have the brake disc, you have your bearings, you have your grease seals, you have your snap rings, you have your mounting hardware, nuts, bolts, and washers, and that's what makes up a complete main wheel assembly. We're going to do what we did with the brake assembly, dissect it, talk about each individual component separately. Tie bolts. Make sure that if you have tie bolts that have a countersink washer, that countersink washer should always go towards the head of the bolt. 2, make sure when you're torquing the bolts down, whether it should be dry torque or lube torque. Look in our maintenance manuals or technician service guide. The information is there. Those are key things for that. Grease seals. Molded grease seals are now replacing the felt seals. We have only maybe a handful of wheels that still use the felt seals. In many cases, you go to replace the felt seals and you're looking at our product catalog, you're not going to find the felt part number, you're only going to find the molded seal part number, which is a much better option than the old felt style felt that goes in the wheel. The molded seals work out so much better. They keep contaminants out, they keep the grease in. If you're washing your aircraft and you're washing your wheels, you're still going to have to monitor that. And if you're washing the wheels too well, then you're going to have to repack your bearings as well.
This is a great point for everybody. If you're looking at an inexpensive upgrade that should be done the next time you're going in annual, the idea of getting rid of those old felt seals, if you can, that apply to your aircraft, and switching over to molded seals can really help save your bearings, the races, the inside of those wheels. I mean, it's a great upgrade. You should talk to your shop about if you don't do it yourself.
Right. All right. This may not pertain to the folks on webinar here, but if you do have a aircraft that has a disc with slots in it, heat relief slots as we call them, make sure that they don't have any cracks in there. Even hairline cracks are reasons for concern. There are a few exceptions where the cracks are allowed, but in 98% of the brake discs that we manufacture, cracks are not permissible. Coning, 15 thousandths doesn't seem like a whole lot to be calling it a cone disc. But if you take this and look at the larger picture, if you have a cone disc and worn linings, it's not going to really matter. If you have a cone disc and you install new linings with that cone disc, now you have a little bit of an issue, because when you torque everything down, you're going to have a binding effect. So what do you do with this cone disc? Absolutely nothing. Get rid of it. Get yourself a new disc, because there is no repair or replacement is the only thing that you can do with the cone disc, 15 thousandths or more. You can certainly blend out a wheel. I have no problems with that. Set your watch. 2 to 3 minutes is the max amount of time that you want to clean up your wheel to get rid of any kind of blemishes. If it goes beyond that, then you are going to remove too much material, and it will become an unsafe venture for you to continue or put that wheel back into service, especially here in the left side where they're showing blending out some blemishes in the bead seat area. That's the most critical area of the wheel, and if you get that area too thin, you're going to have some serious issues that you don't want to encounter. All right, so if you get a wheel that's looking like this, badly pitted, badly corroded in the bearing bore area, in the air valve area, only situation there is to replace it. That's the only thing that you can do. You can't fix that. You can't repair it at all. It's replaceable. All right, so bearing cleaning. Yes, you want to make sure that you are in fact cleaning the bearings to make sure that they are still serviceable. One of the things that you definitely want to do that's not being done here is you want to have protection over your hands, not necessarily for your hands, but for the bearings, because if you're cleaning the bearings and using your bare hands, the bearing is corroding as you're doing the cleaning. So you want to make sure that you do have gloves or something on your hands to protect the bearing. Also, using the brush to clean up is not recommended, because sometimes those little bristles can get stuck in one of the rollers, and that can cause you to prematurely fail the bearing as well. When it comes to greasing the bearing, there are many different types of wheel bearing greases out there. We use Mobile SHC 100 Aviation across the board, unless we're talking amphibious, and then we use a green grease for the amphibious. You can use Mobile 28, Aeroshell 22, or Aeroshell 5, but do not ever mix any of the greases together, because that will cause you problems and it will possibly prematurely fail your bearings. All right, cracks. yes, the crack that you see there in front of you is very excessive. If it's only a minor crack, it doesn't matter. A crack is a crack. A crack's never going to get smaller. It's only going to grow, and it's only going to cause you problems. So once you see and have established that crack, whether it's through NDT, a visual, eddy current, whatever the case may be, make sure that that crack wheel half is replaced. And no matter how often we say it, how we say it, someone is always going to try you. So in this particular case, someone actually tried to weld the wheel together. Obviously, you know this wasn't a magnesium wheel assembly, because it would be definitely a different story. So it was an aluminum wheel, and they tried to weld the bead seat area, not only on the inboard side of the wheel, but they tried to do it on the outboard as well. And that's certainly a no-no. Nobody's going to sign off on that. And that is definitely falls outside of the safe category. Get rid of it, get yourself another wheel half. Again, just like the brake assemblies, make sure that you do follow the proper torque values for your wheel assemblies as well. Is vital to the life of the wheel assemblies, and it makes a difference if you torque it to 90 inch-pounds, whether you torque it to 75 inch-pounds, whether it's dry torque, whether it's loop torque. Please follow the manuals. Lining conditioning procedure. If you want to get the longest life expected out of your linings and discs, because you pay a great deal of money for them, so you want to ensure that you're going to get the longest life possible. Do the conditioning procedures. Make sure you follow the proper conditioning procedures. If it's organic, it gives you step-by-step instructions. If it's metallic, it also gives you step-by-step instructions. And don't mix up the two or confuse the two. Organic is the holes with going all the way through the lining, and the metallic is the lining that uses pins, and the hole does not go all the way through the pad, and it has a metal backing plate. Doing the wrong conditioning procedure will definitely land you in trouble. This was a brand new conversion kit out of the box. They did everything right installing it, but they failed when it came to doing the correct conditioning procedure. They actually did the wrong conditioning procedure and ended up discoloring everything. And once they inspected it, they found that none of the brake discs, the wheel halves, the brake housings, back plate, pressure plate, none of it was serviceable. They actually had to purchase a brand new kit.
Wow, and you're talking thousands of dollars on that, and you notice from that previous steps that Vern showed here, I don't know if you can easily read it, but one of the most important things on that organic lining steps is allowing it to cool for 10 or 15 minutes. And 10 or 15 minutes waiting on the ground is not something that sometimes people are very patient for, but it is incredibly important to do before you proceed past that.
Absolutely. All right, and this pretty much wraps up the presentation. Sandy Schickel is the primary person on the technical hotlines. I am a backup to Sandy just because I travel a great deal. If you're going to be at Oshkosh next week, like I say, please stop by the booth. Sandy will be there, and I will be there as well. Happy to answer any of your questions. Sandy plans to have live chat going next week as well. It may be a few little spotty outages, but for the most part, we will be there. And I thank you all so much for taking the time and being with us this evening on this Cleveland Wheel and Brake Maintenance webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Vern. I really appreciate your time tonight, and thank you to everyone who took the time out of their evening, this webinar week, Wednesday before AirVenture, to join us for this. For SocialFlight, I'm Jeff Simon. A recording of this webinar will be available on SocialFlight's YouTube channel. Just search on one word, SocialFlight, on YouTube, and we will also send out an email hopefully tomorrow with once we complete the recording production, and have that out there for all of you. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We have another webinar tomorrow night as part of Webinar Week. And until then, blue skies. I'm Jeff Simon for SocialFlight. Have a good night.